and I have just gone live. I think like 1 minute late, which is like not too bad. And I actually have no idea really what I'm going to talk about today. Yesterday, I was speaking about the trajectory of revolutions, how I got interested in political revolutions, and a friend watched it and was curious about some of that trajectory. And I got a bit nervous basically thinking about that, because it's like, oh, it's been a really long time since I thought about that. And also, I'm not really a historian, so my background is in literature. And so I only have these kind of vague, sketchy outlines in terms of, I'm going to turn on the light actually. What a lot of these events are about. And I've also been listening to a lot of this Historiansplaining podcast, which I can highly recommend. And that is a podcast of a friend of mine, Sam Biagetti, who I mentioned yesterday, or the last time I recorded. I'm losing track of days here. And he's got a sort of deconstructionist methodology. So he likes to look at how did ideas about history come about. So it's almost like, I suppose it is historiography, which is a word I always associate with Tolstoy, who in War and Peace is spending a lot of time thinking about how we understand history. So I am just checking this thing. So I've got the chat open here. I don't think there's anyone actually in here, but it would be good to know. Yeah, just I'll check it occasionally as I go forward, but mostly I'm going to be looking at what I've already got open. So when it comes to political revolutions, I can remember I was on a train to Paris, I think, and I was listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, which is a pretty popular podcast about history. He's kind of also an amateur. I say also because I'm an amateur at everything, basically. And I think it was the one on is it Storm Over Asia or something like that, about the Mongol invasions. And I just kept thinking, there's something about this process of Mongol invasions that seems familiar. Like it seems to kind of match up with a few other periods of history somehow, like something's sort of virally spreading maybe. And I think he has a view that, or at least this is the impression I got around that time, which is that one of the killer features of the Mongol Empire is that they accept converts, and they do it in a not fun way, which is basically, a lot of times it's like assimilate or die, which is basically a pretty easy choice for a lot of people to make. I mean, not everyone, some people will fight and die, I guess. And a lot did die. And so the period we're talking about, I always get it wrong. Is it like 1100s, 1000s, something like that? 1100s, really. It's like the end of the 12th century, I guess. Okay, that's something I should just know. And I just looked up Genghis Khan's birthday, basically. So he was born 1162, died 1227. Now, I have this vague impression from that podcast, that Dan Carlin one, that these guys, these nomadic tribes of the Mongol steppe, as I'm reading off of Wikipedia, were there for a very long time. So like the Greeks already kind of had run-ins with them. I feel like it's in is it in Thucydides or Xenophon or something? Xenophon, is kind of known for marching into Syria and all that in about 400 BC, something like that. I could be wrong about that. So he's a student, quote unquote student, a contemporary of Plato's, and they're both potential students, or at least they hung out with Socrates. And I was having a conversation on Sunday about that whole situation, basically about Plato. And Xenophon is another guy that's in Athens at this time. But I think unlike Plato, so Socrates definitely fought as a soldier. And I actually don't know about Plato. I don't know how much we know about that. I know that Plato, like, I think his mother gets into trouble in this 30 Tyrants period or something. But Xenophon is another one of these guys, and he also he has this thing called the March of the 10,000. Or no, is that right? It's called the Anabasis, the going down, and I think it's called the. Anyway, so whether or not it's him who talks about like these people, and who is it on the Mongolian steppe? Like are the Scythians there? I'm showing my completely American notions about where things are in Central Asia. Although on Saturday I met someone from Kyrgyzstan, and she was very surprised that I knew basically anything about that region, which I know very little, just to be clear. But so Mongolian Manchurian grassland, so it's pretty far up northeast. Should I be showing you like my other screen? I don't really know. Should I like yeah, maybe I will do that. So I'm going to try and just share my screen. I can see that there is a chat. If you are in the chat and would like to say hello, I would be very happy to hear from you and to take questions. So that's kind of the ultimate goal of doing these live. It's not just to have a fun time on Twitch, but actually to kind of, just have some kind of rapport if possible. And hopefully this is not too boring. I'm just trying to add a stream. I should have done this before I started streaming. Okay, start screen sharing. I'll just give you my entire screen, I guess, even though that's going to probably give you this weird effect. Okay. So, has that showed up? Now you're seeing all my other stuff. Okay, so yeah, you are seeing everything now because I'm seeing myself see you. So nomadic tribes. Okay, I got to bring it back to what the hell? Why am I talking about the Mongolian stuff? So the idea is that before a certain point, let's say in the time of the ancient Greeks, whenever these, I should just find out where these ancient Greeks are. So I'm going to add a thing, be like, find out who was in the steppes during the time, something like that. Who was on the steppes? And the idea that I remember getting out of Dan Carlin, or around this time, so maybe I was doing some other reading around it, is that there was constant internecine strife, right? Like all these nomadic tribes, they're in Central Asia, they're just constantly fighting each other. And let's say this is like 400 BC. So then they spend like kind of like 1600 years, because by the time the Mongols kind of come out of that region, they are, it's like 1200 AD, right? So, and just to come back to the figure that I started to talk about, but didn't finish, the numbers are huge for the Mongol invasion. Yeah, so first, the geographic scale is huge. It becomes the largest contiguous empire in history after his death. And I want to like not just say the wrong thing. My impression is that, okay, here we go. Estimates of the number of people who died as a consequence of of Genghis Khan's military campaign. And I think you're supposed to say Genghis Khan or something like that. Here we go. Genghis. Yeah. Okay. Similar to, this is kind of interesting, right? Chinggis. So apparently it was the Italian pronunciation that made it more like Genghis. Genghis Khan. Okay. But is it like a I think it's Genghis. Okay. Anyway. So the point is, the estimates of how many people died just under his campaigns, and the Mongol Empire lasted a bit longer and then kind of faded into these little less relevant things. 4 million to up to 60 million, which in the 12th century is like, wait, what? 60 million people died? Because there weren't all that many people. I mean, I kind of feel like, okay, it sticks at like a billion for a long time, right? But I think in the 1200s, it's not actually that close to a billion. So this is a big deal, is the first thing. Second thing is this, and I was talking last time about complexity dynamics. So one of the things that Dan Carlin talks about is that it's almost like these guys were stuck in this same region for 1600 years or even longer, right? They kind of have that, like horses essentially come out of here. They're very, very good as cavalry. And they also are constantly fighting each other. And the typical procedure once you subjugate one of these tribal enemies was apparently like you just kill everyone, basically, or you take the women and you kill the men. So the effect of this is that if you're constantly doing that, one, you're probably always getting better at fighting, because it's pretty like you're gonna end up fighting in this civilization. And I could be completely wrong about this. This is my impression from a podcast. But the idea here is that like the killer feature or the big change that comes with Genghis Khan is just that he stops doing that. So basically you've got this kind of contained, like extremely bellicose, warlike society where everyone's fighting against each other, like really, really intense competition. And then he basically just says, hey, why don't we just not kill everyone when we defeat them, but instead allow them to join us? And so this is kind of like a policy tweak that ends up making the whole thing go viral. And so, and the viral thing is, of course, that now you can convert and join this thing. And if the alternative is to die, it's seems like a good thing to do. And then if you just keep applying this, and I'm not saying that Genghis Khan was always let everyone live. There's lots of stories of some people resist him. He gets kind of annoyed. He reroutes a river to erase any evidence, to erase the entire history of this, place that he's conquered or whatever. He was not there's starting to be after centuries or many, many centuries of just considering him the worst guy ever. There started to be a kind of rehabilitation of Genghis Khan, saying like, oh, actually he's kind of a reformer, and actually he has like religious tolerance because he had some favorite concubine or whatever who is Christian, and I think they like take Baghdad, right? And it's like, yeah, the Battle of Baghdad, and then they really, really kill everyone they can there. It's like not an experience. In fact, yeah, I mean, I kind of have this impression that this is the end of the end of Islam kind of being the intellectual center of the world or whatever. And yeah, that's exactly what this says. The siege is considered to mark the end of the Islamic Golden Age, during which the caliphs had extended their rule from the Iberian Peninsula to Sindh. Where's Sindh? Pakistan. Okay. Interesting. So, so what am I saying? I'm saying that you can see why, like in complexity terms, it's like this minor tweak to the rules. And maybe it sounds really insensitive to say that this is a minor tweak, given that it affected and potentially ended the lives of millions or even tens of millions of people. But the idea is that like there's something in common with this and also like the spread of Islam, for example, where, and I don't know a huge amount of that, but it's like, if you say you can join us, then that might lead to like exponential growth, right? Which is a kind of like, and if there are like network effects, I don't know. So I am just kind of like thinking aloud about one of the things that made me think in complexity terms, because I was like, oh, this is like a weird sort of boiling over of what was like a contained, intense period of competition. And so competition in my mind, it's not just like Darwinian in the sense that you have variation and selection in an intense way, but also, yeah, and in this case, it's literally life or death, right? So they're probably getting very, very good at whatever they're doing. But it's like trial and error. Everyone's trying things out within this contained region. And then when that kind of starts to spill over, it's like, yeah, it's kind of like it's like an explosion, right? Which is that they're now coming in contact very rapidly with a bunch of people that don't do this kind of warfare, basically. So that was just like a kind of talking a little bit about one of the things that got me interested in this is like, what if history, itself follows some kind of patterns? And I'm very well aware that, I'm not the first person to think that. And, there's this kind of Gibbonian decline and fall kind of narrative. This is the guy in the, I think 17th century, right? No, 18th century, sorry. 1737 to 1794. And basically he writes this decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And it's this kind of idea that, so he's writing it in 1776 to 1788. I should have known that, really. Known for the quality and irony of its prose, its use of primary sources, and its polemical criticism of organized religion. So it's a good story, in other words. And I will be talking a lot more about narrative and story and stuff like that. But I don't want to be like too reductive and say like in my mind, the Gibbonian, I don't even know if that's a word, the narrative of Edward Gibbon is basically like Rome starts out as this kind of small, virtuous republic where everyone is really sweet and virtuous and like, just like, I don't know, that disciplined or something like that, like whatever. I'm guessing he's Protestant. So it's probably like they work hard and they, it doesn't really matter. View about what things are good. So maybe the early Roman Republic. Yeah. So he writes, sorry, I just read that. He wrote polemics against organized religion. Okay. So, but Gibbon's view, it's like the Romans are there and they are this small virtuous band. And then because they're so virtuous or something like that, they're ascendant and they defeat other people in their vicinity. And from there, they become more and more, they start to multiply and gain this kind of preeminence in the region. But then they become kind of the victims of their own success, and as they accumulate material wealth and things like that, they become decadent, and they start to, they lose the moral connection to what they had when they were this small band. And then, once they do that, then they're kind of on the way out, and this leads to this fall of the Roman Empire. It's quite popular now to point out that only really the Western Roman Empire falls, right? Byzantium, Constantinople. Well, yeah. So Constantinople like remains standing until I think like when did the Ottomans get there? I'm gonna guess. See, this is how you learn dates, and I'm not good at it. I was gonna say I've already seen it. I was gonna guess 15th century, and I think it is 15th century. So, so the Ottomans get there in 1453. So Byzantine Empire. Yeah, and Constantine constantly comes up. He's someone that I'm going to eventually have to drill down into. My wife's been reading this book about early Christianity, and there's a lot of debates about whether Constantine is like to the degree to which he believes in Christianity, the degree to which he's actually not, like he's secretly pagan or something like that. So the overall idea here, how did I get onto Constantinople? Oh, because only the Western Roman Empire falls. So the Gibbonian narrative is like, they start out as small virtuous band. They become very successful in the region thanks to these whatever moral virtues. And I'm saying all this without having read the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, but maybe I should read it. Although I've just seen it's a 6-volume work, so maybe I shouldn't read it. Especially because it seems to be kind of a problematic piece of writing, but people seem to like it, and it is a good story. Like there's a reason probably that it's still reprinted, which is probably that it's quite good, quite well written. Oh, and it does go all the way to Byzantium. Interesting, because I would have thought that he kind of takes on this narrative that, oh, there's this dark age thing that happens after the fall of the Roman Empire. So the reason I'm bringing up Gibbon is because I don't want to just like hear this thing about the Mongol invasions and then just assume this kind of declensionist narrative, which is like, oh, well, these people on the steppes are in this intense battle for this period, and because of that, the hard virtue that comes out of that, they become successful, and then they come to dominate this big region, and then they decline as victims of their own success. Although it is like, that's not like, just because it sounds Gibbonian doesn't mean it's necessarily totally wrong. One thing is that the golden horde that follows the Mongol Empire. So you got these guys, pretty big region, as you can see. And I think you can see. Self-designated as Ulug Ulus, great state in Turkic. I mean, this is the other thing. Like, so Kyrgyzstan and all these other, not all, but many of the stands speak these Turkic languages. I think Uzbek and maybe is Uzbek Turkic? I think so. Or is it? So some of them are, so it is Turkic. Some of them are Turkic, and a few are more like Persian. I think that's Tajik language. Dari, Persian language. Yeah. So it's like, yeah. If you are in the chat and would like to say hello or ask any question about what the hell I am on about, I would welcome that. I am also not sure where I'm going totally. Just saying that yeah, the way that I originally started thinking about complexity dynamics in history was through thinking about the Mongol kind of like seeming explosion. Whether explosion is like a good way of viewing that or not, I have not actually I've not fully like gotten to that. Now, revolutions. So that was why I was like really interested in revolutions. And I was like, okay, who's written about revolutions? And one of the issues was I could just read about the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the American Revolution or all these other things that we call a revolution. But I was also curious about what I was also curious about what the general characteristics are of revolutions. And that's what led me to Thomas Kuhn, actually. But interestingly, so Kuhn is massively influenced by Darwin. And in the very last chapters of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn basically says that he thinks that the way science operates is something like Darwinian variation and selection. At the same time, it's very conspicuous that he's writing this kind of meta book about scientific revolutions, and he doesn't choose to cover Darwin. He covers physics. He covers, in terms of Newton and the Ptolemaic system, as well as Einstein. And then he also covers chemistry with Lavoisier. He covers, I think, like optics. He definitely talks a little bit about optics and talks about like electricity, this bell jar stuff, and or Leyden jar stuff, not bell jar. And so, yeah. But one of the interesting things is that he not only does he not really talk about Darwin as being revolutionary, but also Darwin himself uses the term revolution, because basically, I'm going to just show you this probably. Because I think it was like the Glorious Revolution. Yeah, so this is from this guy, Christopher Hill, who is writing about Thomas Kuhn. And, okay, that's annoying. My silly scripts divided this thing up. So basically, like, what Christopher Hill is pointing out is that the connotation of the word revolution changes over time. And in the 1640s, the English Civil War made revolution seem violent, chaotic, terrible, and stuff like that. But then by 1688, it had become a sort of, because of the Glorious Revolution, which was more popular and seemed to be less crazy, I guess. So let's see. See, I know very little about this period of history. Constitutionally, the outcome of the wars established a precedent that an English monarch cannot govern without Parliament's consent, that the idea of parliamentary sovereignty was legally established only as part of the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So then what Hill is saying is that revolution goes from something kind of bad and violent and not great to something that is more positive. And of course, today we have both senses, right? But I think in general, it's considered a positive term. Like if we talk about that's this revolutionary change or whatever, it does, at least to my ears, have a kind of positive connotation today. But it can't always have had that. And I need to think about the overall trajectory of that word, because of course it has this idea of like turning around. and it gets used in this scientific revolutions thing. But I'm kind of blanking on what the so in political science, revolutio, a turnaround in Latin, is a fundamental and relatively sudden change in political power and political organization. So within this history of science, right, there's Copernican revolution from the Ptolemaic system. Okay, now this is also interesting. 1957 book by Thomas Kuhn. So maybe this term Copernican revolution comes from Kuhn. I'm not entirely sure. But the thing that I'm trying to get at is Darwin also uses this term in the sense that Kuhn means it. So where can I find it? Well, one way we can find it is just go to Origin of Species. And this, which edition is this? So there's like 6 editions of Origin of Species, and the first one, I was going to say that people typically read the second one, and then I've just read that the 6th edition is considered the definitive edition. So my understanding is that the first edition of Origin of Species is as close. I mean, of course, it's just what Darwin thinks. The second edition starts to it actually just corrects like typos or whatever. Like it just fixes a few things. And then as the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th edition come out, he starts to like revise his ideas and go more towards this, I guess what we today call Darwinian logic, that it's more about competition or something like that. I feel like it was influenced. I could be totally wrong. I mean, when is Spencer writing? I guess Herbert Spencer's around. Yeah. I guess what I'm talking about is social Darwinism. And I actually don't know if that's exactly what he's introducing, but I just remember something about the content of the idea starts to change. That I can say with some confidence between the 2nd and 6th editions. So this is what we want is the 2nd edition. And what we want to search for is revolution. There we go. Isn't that satisfying when you just find it on the first damn search you do? Okay, I'll just read this because Darwin's writing is like literally beautiful. Okay. And Darwin is kind of a gradualist. This is, ironically, you might think that people who think that there are drastic revolutions in geology where basically there's this whole debate going on that Darwin's involved in within geology, and it does relate to revolutions. Basically, there's this starting position, which is that it's essentially a creationist view. So you read Genesis and you say, okay, well, there's these like 7 days of creation, or 6 days and a day off, or whatever. And in that time, a lot of drastic things happen, right? Like there's kind of just like wind and void at the beginning, and then there's light, and then there's I don't know, fish first of all, and then there's stuff on the land, and then I can't remember I'm probably getting that all wrong. In fact, why don't I just look it up? mean, is Bible info going to tell us this? Okay. Light. Yeah, I remember this. Okay. Atmosphere and firmament, dry ground and plants. See, they've already, well, I'm thinking if they've got this wrong in evolutionary terms. Sun, moon, and stars. Well, that's clearly wrong. Birds and sea creatures, also kind of wrong, right? But of course, I'm just telling it. We're just telling the other story. So, like, just going from memory, we've got non aerobic respiration and photosynthesis, right, going on from pretty much the start of the Earth, like 4 point something. Like it keeps getting pushed back closer and closer to the very early Hadean stages of the Earth, and then so life already kind of starts, and then there's this explosion of oxygen, which I think is about 2.4 or 2.45 billion years ago. And then I think multicellularity, actually, I'm not totally sure. Something happens at 1.1 billion years. And what they're talking about in day 3 in the Bible, plants, if they're talking about plants on land, I think that's like 440 million years ago. I think it's in the Devonian. So in other words, a lot of stuff happens in the ocean before it happens on land. And so I think this period, I mean, there's this Cambrian explosion at 590 million years ago. At some point, it would be good to dig into the history of that idea that there is this explosion, because it's also controversial and it's also related to revolutions. So to get back to Darwin is the default position of these English guys is basically that because of the Bible, well, one, they don't know how old the Earth is. It's only like within a few generations before Darwin, especially with this guy Lyell. And I'll guess that he's writing at the start of the 19th century, but let's see. Yeah, or even mid 19th century. He's born in 1797. So, okay, so what's going on? So Lyell starts to discover how old the world is, and it's way older than anyone thinks, right? They think it's like a few tens of thousands of years old, and then they're like starting to work out that no, it must be much, much older. So you might think that the revolutionary view is that revolutions occur in geology and that there are these sudden and drastic changes. But in fact, that's the default assumption, because they think the Earth is not that old, that God is some kind of intelligent creator. God is very involved in this whole process in terms of like saying this is going to happen, and then it happens. And so those changes are understood to be drastic. What's revolutionary, this is the funny thing, is that Darwin's about to describe Lyell as revolutionary. And Lyell is, and of course, revolutionary, we now have this kind of revolutionary reactionary divide where things that are considered revolutionary kind of tend to be seen as left wing or maybe bottom up or something like that. And then we have this reactionary kind of top down authoritarian or whatever view of the opposite. But revolutionary just means it turned around. And so maybe it's not weird that the revolutionary thing in this term seems, I don't know if it seems conservative, but in a way it does. Because what Darwin is saying is that Lyell produces a revolution. That revolution results in a more conservative view of how long things take, and also just that they're more gradual. So this begins the kind of debate, which I think gets named by William Whewell. I actually have no idea how to say his name. And in fact, I know his passage opens, see the Bridgewater treatise up here. Whewell It's Whewell. Hue. No, I'm saying it in the Old English way. Did you know in Old English, anything that starts with a WH in modern English once had a HW. So it was like where, when, what. In fact, I think Beowulf starts with a kind of what. So I'm tempted to say whool, but I'm guessing other people say, this is why we should just, okay, this is probably really boring for everyone, but this guy is he's one of these people that like, a bit like John von Neumann or something like that. Like you may have heard his name, but then it's like, he's one of those people that everyone's like, oh my God, he was the smartest guy ever. See, this is the English polymath. And he somehow, I was going to say he didn't leave that much of behind, but then he created a lot of words. He coined, among other terms, scientist, physicist, linguistics, consilience, catastrophism, uniformitarianism, and astigmatism. Now, and he suggested some terms to Faraday. So the ones that we're talking about now are catastrophism and uniformitarianism. Catastrophism is the view that, and it comes from geology, and this is important because this idea then spreads into biology. Catastrophism is the idea that the history of the earth is a series of catastrophes. So whether that's God, in these acts of creation, it's very sudden, it's abrupt, there's these kind of step changes. And the opposite view is called uniformitarianism, which is that although it looks like all this really dramatic stuff has happened to the geology of the earth, in fact, what we're seeing is not abrupt changes, but just the same very small changes that we observe in the daily, that we can observe today, but over vast timescales. And so that's the uniformitarian view. And first, let's just read what Ewell says. Oh yeah, I opened his page to check how his name is pronounced. Whewell. Okay, well that's easy. Whewell. Okay, so you can just ignore that double W. Okay, William Whewell. Whewell. Okay, so, but with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. Okay, this is actually going to be really important for me because I'm going to do a whole thing about the idea of laws of physics and how they relate to the laws of man and the origins of laws within human societies. But oh God, this is good. Okay, and so, yeah, and look, and then Darwin's taking this as a thing and saying laws of this, laws of that, laws of that. Okay, I'm gonna have to just devote probably a stream at some point to laws. And let's just quickly, what am I going to say? Revolution. Okay. On the lapse of time, here's Darwin, about halfway through the book, chapter 9, on the imperfection of the geological record. He's very big on this, and actually this still has effects. This is still like debated today. Is the fossil record very more like, yeah, is the historical, like, are the traces that remain to archaeology or to paleontology very sparse and rare and unhelpful, or are they actually like not that sparse? And Darwin's view is that it's very sparse, it's extremely imperfect, and this allows him to get a more not gradualist, uniformitarian view of what's going on, because he's saying, look, it changes very slowly over time. The reason it looks abrupt is because we just have these tiny snapshots of fossils or something like that just give us almost no information. And then we see this, what appears to be a big jump. And he's like, yeah, but there's like millions and millions of years in there. And there's actually been some recent writing about this as well, just about how periods like like the early Triassic, I'm just making one up. In fact, I could probably find that passage if it is of interest. Please say in the chat if that is of interest, and I will look it up after this. It's about how some periods of tens of millions of years in history are represented by like a single fossil, which is like, I didn't know that, and like I feel like we should think about that when we talk about these enormous periods of time. But here's Darwin on the lapse of time. Independently of our not finding fossil remains of such infinitely numerous connecting links, it may be objected that time will not have sufficed for so great an amount of organic change, all changes having been effected very slowly through natural selection. I feel like I should parse that again. Independently of our not finding fossil remains of such infinitely numerous connecting links, it may be objected that time will not have sufficed for so great an amount of organic change, all changes having been effected very slowly through natural selection. So if we can't find fossils, you may object, there can't have been enough time. We see this snapshot and this snapshot, and they seem irreconcilable. And how could it have changed this much through this really slow process that he's describing called natural selection? And he says, it is hardly possible for me even to recall to the reader, who may not be a practical geologist. Side note is that Darwin always considered himself to be a geologist first and foremost. And I am not a practical geologist. I'm assuming by practical geologist, he means like an applied, like basically the kind that goes out into field and picks up rocks and stuff. And on that, we will eventually go to John McPhee. But it is hardly possible for me even to recall to the reader, who may not be a practical geologist, the facts leading the mind feebly to comprehend the lapse of time. He who can read Sir Charles Lyell's grand work on the principles of geology, and this is when was this written? 1830 to 1833. So Lyell is like 33 to 36, basically. He's really on it. Oh God, isn't that a beautiful sentence? What is that? Who uses this construction? It's like, who among us, or something like that. Anyway, he who can read Sir Charles Lyell's grand work on the principles of geology, which the future historian will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, yet does not admit how incomprehensibly vast have been the past periods of time, may at once close this volume. Not that it suffices to study the principles of geology, or to read special treatises by different observers on separate formations, and to mark how each author attempts to give an inadequate idea of the duration of each formation, or even each stratum. A man must for years examine for himself great piles of superimposed strata and watch the sea at work, grinding down old rocks and making fresh sediment, before he can hope to comprehend anything of the lapse of time, the monuments of which we see around us. And I have said elsewhere how insanely good Darwin's prose is, but it is also incredible that you can just open like literally I was like, I know he talks about Lyell as kind of being a revolution, and what a stunning paragraph. There's a lot going on there. I mean, look, this internal rhyme of vast and past, superimposed strata, all these, it's the sibilants, and watch the sea at work grinding down old rocks and making fresh sediment before he can hope to comprehend anything of the lapse of time, the monuments of which we see around us. So basically, he is saying that a revolution has happened. And the earlier guy is Cuvier, Georges Cuvier, a catastrophist. And is he like in French naturalist and zoologist, founding father of paleontology? I guess he was the first one to kind of have this idea that maybe we should compare animals with the fossil record and figure out if anything in the fossil record looks like it might still be alive or something like that. But so he precedes Lyell, and he has a catastrophist view. Darwin is massively influenced by Lyell, and he thinks that the slow, constant forces predominate. All of this may be an issue of zoom levels. How deep do you go? And I am just, checking the chat. This abrupt versus jumps may be about what the discipline is looking at. Yeah, absolutely. It could be a, and that's what I was kind of saying is like over a long enough period, you might say this is like gradual, but then if you zoom in, there are these kind of step changes. Paleontology versus biology. Yeah, so paleontology, the fossil record, if it is very sparse, will make it look discontinuous. And right versus geologists. Not quite sure what that one means. Could you say more? Look what I've got here. Guilds, states, and societies in the early Middle Ages. The early medieval guilds of Northwest Europe were very different from their later medieval descendants. They were not specifically urban or economic in focus, instead being based on religious devotion, feasting, and mutual protection. Okay, so what I would normally do is, damn it. Is this gonna work? I'm going to say, yeah, and I'm curious about, should I be, I mean, this is interesting, right? Early medieval guilds of Northwest Europe were very different from their later medieval descendants. They were not urban or economic. They were more about religious devotion, feasting, and mutual protection, usually among members united by status and geography. Okay. I kind of think it's like, I have this, I think what I was asking before was like, is it interesting? I don't know, it's the Anthropocene. What is the Holocene versus the Anthropocene? Holocene. I should really know this. Okay, yeah, I know this one. Okay, this is like and after the last glacial period. And what are we with this one? Anthropocene is a geographical. Yeah, revolutions can look continuous and conservative versus discontinuous. Yeah, this is one that I just don't know. I've just heard people say, well, there is, in fact, David Valerio in the conversation that we had recently, and I'm thinking about whether to release that just as a podcast, because I had a friend listen to it recently. And his view is that there's not really a distinction between, it's not like either it's discontinuous or it's continuous. It's like a matter of like zoom, which is like, if you zoom in enough, everything looks discontinuous. Like you could even say, and then this gets us into questions of digital and analog, but also like discrete and continuous. Like, we treat, the table as being continuous, but there are actually gaps in it. There's this question of, my understanding, which is limited, is that all of physics depends on time being continuous, but we also kind of know that there probably is a minimum, like discrete level of time or something. I think is it like the Planck, something to do with Planck, something, I can't remember. So one possible, and then I've also heard, what's his name, Matt Ridley. I'm not really engaged in any of his work, but someone was talking about his view that, once you get enough computers, which are all doing these discrete programs, and you get something like Facebook, then some of the dynamics that come out of huge systems of computers end up being having like wave-like functions that are more characteristic of continuous, like better described by continuous mathematics than by discrete ones, even though they're of course made up of individual people, computers, whatever. I actually just don't know the answer to this. Like, my view, so it's also a huge debate between Dawkins, who is much more uniformitarian, and Stephen Jay Gould, who is very discontinuous, right? He basically thinks, he's talking about punctuated equilibrium and stuff like that. So if your view is, well, they're just arguing at different frames, like maybe that's true. I actually just don't know. But okay. So Anthropocene, yeah, is this interesting to anyone besides me? I don't know. They seem to be different somehow. I haven't yet figured that out. Maybe I'll just shelve that one. But I don't know whether this is interesting, but because I mentioned it, I'll just look up what he says. And this is see, look, on geological timescales, human civilization is an event, not an epoch. Sounds like a similar kind of claim, right? Okay. Yeah, this is what I remember. Yes, billions of dinosaur bodies died and fell to Earth here in this span, and trillions more dinosaur footsteps pressed into the Earth, but hardly a trace remains today. A cryptic smattering of lakeside footprints represents their entire contribution to the Triassic period. A few bones and footsteps miraculously preserved in New England and Nova Scotia are all that remain from the entire 27 million year early Jurassic epoch. No trace of dinosaurs remains whatsoever from the 18 million year late Jurassic. A handful of bones, good, a handful of dust, from one layer in Maryland represents the entire 45 million year early Cretaceous. The late Cretaceous gives up a Hadrosaurus in New Jersey and part of a Tyrannosaur in Alabama, but mostly comprises unimpressive fragments of bone and teeth that cover the remaining 34 million years of the Earth's most storied age until doomsday. If one wanted to know what a particular 10 or 100 or 1,000 year span was like, buried in this vastness of time, or even worse, in some particular region of the continent, good luck. And he's got this vastness of time, which is the kind of Darwinian thing. So I think my point, so to answer the last question, continuous revolution in Darwin's time could be used either to say we're going from the more, let's say, conservative or stable one to the more chaotic one, or back. Whereas now it feels to me like we say, when we say revolutionary, we kind of mean the one that leads to more chaos. And when we mean the one that turns back to something more conservative, if we do mean that, we do we call that a revolution? I guess we would if the government is overthrown or whatever. I'm just thinking aloud here. I think I actually don't have a strong view on this. Revolutionary, I don't know. I just don't know. So I am gonna probably leave it there, and try and find where I have set up my thing. Oh, you can see me zoom into infinity, and how do I like make that one go off? Yeah, there's just me. So now I'm looking at myself on the screen behind me, so I'm going to change that. I am Brian Cam. You may have seen me on Twitch or on YouTube today because I'm streaming to both. I am still very new to this streaming platform, so I would love to have any feedback about what I'm doing stupidly wrong. If you can't read stuff that I'm doing, if it's very boring, you probably turned it off and you're not listening to this right now. But if you are listening to this, any feedback, I would love to hear from you, basically. And I want to involve people in these conversations. I want the chat to be something where people can ask questions and I can kind of answer them if that's interesting. If people would want to get on the call and like talk to me directly, that's also something I'm open to. Basically, I'm just totally open to experimentation. I also want to mention that as I do this, I'm going to try and do this pretty frequently, I think, because it's turning out to be a way of working through some stuff that I'm thinking about in a way that feels low effort and probably isn't going to be very edited, as opposed to, I'm still a bit nervous about putting things on the podcast. So I am going to be doing this more frequently. And I've just finally, after much procrastination, deliberation, just fear, put up a Patreon. So if you want to support my work, which I intend to give freely, basically, like my idea is that I'm following my interests freely and voluntarily and giving away my time and effort and work. And who knows what's going to happen in the distant future, but I don't really want to charge anything for anything, really, even books or whatever. Like I would, like if I were to write a book, I would be very tempted to just like open source the damn thing. And if you wanted to buy a copy, then fair enough. But essentially what I'm saying is this is voluntary. This is a voluntary lecture freely given. If you would like to voluntarily support what I'm doing, you can now do that. Patreon.com/Brian Kam. So Brian Cam, BryanKam. And I'm sure there is some way for me to put it in the chat. Does that work? I have some sense that it may or may not. Okay. Anyway, seems to have gone through. So I am going to close this stream now. If you're seeing this elsewhere and would like to follow me or speak or anything like that, that's twitter.com/Brian Cam. And I think I've now closed the chat thingy. But I should actually just post it in there too. Okay, let's see how that goes, and would love to hear from you. And hopefully I'll be streaming sometime soon.